Deathwind. That's what they called him out there. Louis Wetszel didn't make noise when he walked, didn't leave witnesses when he pulled the trigger, and by the time you knew he'd been there, well, you were already gone. The frontier in the 1770s wasn't some romantic wilderness adventure. It was the kind of place where you went to sleep wondering if you'd wake up. And Wetszel? He became the ghost everyone whispered about. Some were terrified of him. Others, they were just glad he was on their side. This is what his life was actually like. Real quick. I know most people just scroll past, but if you've stuck around for a few of these, maybe drop a like. Or don't, honestly. But I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. It's kind of wild knowing someone might be watching this on their lunch break in Munich while I'm here at my desk at 11 p.m. eating leftover pizza. Anyway, we're going back to the 1770s American frontier. But first, seriously, get comfortable. Like actually comfortable. Not that thing where you say you're comfortable, but your neck's at a weird angle. Fix that. Grab whatever you need, because this one's good, and you'll want to stick around. Your eyes flutter open to darkness. The cabin walls creak against the wind, and somewhere outside, an owl calls once, then falls silent. That silence, that's what gets you. In your warm bed right now, silence means peace. But here, silence means danger. You're in a small log cabin on Wheeling Creek, 1770, the western edge of Virginia colony, just a few miles from the mighty Ohio River that marks the boundary between colonial settlements and native territories. This is the Wetszel family home, and it's not exactly what you'd call secure. The floor beneath your feet is hard-packed dirt. The walls are rough-hewn logs with gaps stuffed with mud and moss to keep the wind out. Light comes from one small window covered with oiled paper. Glasses for rich folks back east. The fireplace smoulders with last night's embers, and you need to get it going before the rest of the family wakes. This is normal, you think to yourself, reaching for the fire poker. This is just Tuesday. But wait, I need to back up a bit. Let me tell you how Louis Wetszel came to be here in the first place. Born in 1763, Louis was the son of John Wetszel, a German immigrant, and Mary Bonnet, whose father was a Flemish Huguenot. In 1770, when Louis was just 7 years old, the family packed everything they owned and moved from the relative safety of the eastern settlements into the dangerous Ohio Valley frontier. Why would anyone do that? One word: land. East of the Appalachian Mountains, good farmland was either claimed or expensive, but west, miles of untouched forest, rich soil, and open space. The catch? Well, that land was already being used by people who weren't too happy about newcomers showing up. So you're telling me they just moved into active conflict zones? For farming? Yeah, pretty much. The 1770s frontier wasn't like moving to the suburbs today. This was less new construction with open floor plan and more build your own shelter and hope you don't get killed while doing it. Life on Wheeling Creek meant constant vigilance. The Wetzels and other settler families lived in what was essentially a war zone. The American Revolution was brewing to the east, and here in the west various Native American tribes, primarily Shawnee, Delaware and Wyandot, were fighting to keep their hunting grounds and ancestral homes. For young Louis, daily life was a masterclass in survival. By age 10, he could shoot, track, and move through the woods in near silence. Not because it was fun, because it was necessary. Every child on the frontier learned these skills or risked not making it to adulthood. Morning chores started before dawn. Fetch water from the creek, careful to check for signs of anyone watching. Collect firewood, staying close to the cabin walls. Feed the animals, a few chickens, maybe a milk cow if you're lucky, and always Always keep a weapon within reach. The Wetszel family cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. Beyond their little patch of civilization stretched a wilderness so vast it seemed endless. Those woods provided everything: meat from deer and turkey, fruits and nuts for gathering, timber for building. But they also concealed dangers that city folks back east couldn't imagine. "Look," John Wetszel would tell his sons, including young Lewis, "see how that branch is bent? Someone passed through here. Not a deer, a man." The boys would study the sign: broken twigs, disturbed leaves, a footprint pressed into mud, until they could read the forest like a book. Who passed through, how many, how long ago, which direction they were heading. These weren't hobby skills. This was survival intelligence. When Lewis turned 12, his father handed him his own rifle. "It's time," John said simply. The long-barreled flintlock was nearly as tall as the boy himself, but Lewis didn't stagger under its weight. He'd been waiting for this moment. "Remember," his father warned, "a gun is only as good as the man behind it, and powder and shot don't grow on trees. Make every bullet count." And count they did. Ammunition wasn't something you could just pick up at the local store. Lead balls had to be carefully moulded one by one over a fire. Powder was expensive and had to be kept dry at all costs. A wasted shot meant more than missing dinner. It could mean having nothing to defend yourself with when you needed it most. By 14, Lewis was helping to feed his family with that rifle. He'd grown tall for his age, lean and wiry, with dark hair that hung past his shoulders. His eyes had taken on the perpetual squint of someone who spends his days scanning distant tree lines for movement. Those eyes would save his life on a spring day in 1777. Lewis was outside with his younger brother, Jacob. The boys were supposed to be watching the cornfield, making sure animals didn't get into the newly planted crops. Lewis glanced toward the tree line and froze. Something didn't look right. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and instantly know someone's been there? That prickle on the back of your neck? That's what frontier survival was all about, noticing the thing that doesn't belong. What Lewis spotted was the glint of sunlight on metal. A gun barrel, partially concealed near the corn crib. He started to shout a warning to Jacob, but it came too late. The crack of a rifle split the air, and Lewis felt a searing pain tear through his chest. He was down, gasping, as two warriors burst from the trees. One grabbed Jacob, the other seized Lewis by his long hair. No one else was home to witness it. The boys were simply gone. For 2 days they marched westward into the deep wilderness. Lewis was bleeding from the chest wound, each step agony, but he knew what happened to prisoners who couldn't keep up. They didn't last long, so he gritted his teeth and kept moving, watching, waiting. "You still with me?" he whispered to Jacob when their captors weren't paying attention. His little brother nodded, eyes wide with terror. "Good. Tonight. Be ready." The warriors made camp as darkness fell, confident in their success. Their captives were just boys, one wounded, and they were deep in their own territory now. They ate, talked in their language, and eventually settled down to sleep. But they made one crucial mistake. "They didn't tie us down," Lewis would later tell the story, "like we were too scared to run." When the warrior's breathing deepened into sleep, Lewis nudged his brother. Slowly, silently, they slipped away into the darkness. But Lewis knew they wouldn't get far. Not barefoot, not without supplies, not with warriors who could track them at first light. "Wait here," he whispered to Jacob, hiding him in a hollow log. Then Lewis did something that would define the rest of his life. He went back. Picture this. A 14-year-old boy, chest wound still seeping blood, creeping back into the camp of the very men who'd shot him and taken him captive. Not running away, but toward danger. He moved like a shadow between the sleeping forms. First, he took their moccasins. They'd need footwear. Then, in a decision that crossed a line from escape to revenge, he took one of their rifles. When he returned to Jacob, the younger boy stared in disbelief. "Are you crazy?" Jacob hissed. "They'll kill us for sure now." "They have to catch us first," Lewis replied, already pulling the moccasins onto his feet. "And they have to find us. We need to move. Fast." And so began a desperate flight through the wilderness. By dawn, the warriors were indeed on their trail, closing the distance. Lewis played every trick he knew, doubling back, crossing streams to hide their scent, vanishing into brush so thick it seemed impossible to pass through. "We're not going to make it," Jacob gasped by midday, as they heard the pursuing warriors getting closer. "Yes, we are," Lewis insisted, his face set with a determination that was no longer childlike. "The Ohio River can't be far." He was right. By late afternoon, they reached the mighty Ohio, but crossing presented a new danger. The river was high with spring melt, the current swift and deadly. "I can't swim that," Jacob said, terror in his voice. "We're not swimming," Lewis replied, already scanning the shoreline. "Help me with these logs." Using branches and vines, the boys lashed together a crude raft. It wasn't pretty, but it might float. As the sounds of pursuit grew louder, they pushed their makeshift craft into the water and clung to it as the current swept them away from the shore. The warriors reached the bank just as the boys were mid-river, too far for an accurate shot. Lewis and Jacob eventually made it to the other side, stumbling onto safe ground, exhausted but alive. They had won. They had survived. But something had changed in Lewis Wetszel. The terrified boy who'd been dragged away from his home was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone who'd looked death in the face and decided that from now on he would be the hunter, not the hunted. As they staggered toward the settlement at Wheeling, Lewis made a silent vow. This wouldn't be the last time he crossed paths with the warriors of the Ohio country, but next time he wouldn't be the one running away. "How did it feel?" someone would ask him years later. "Escaping like that?" Lewis Wetszel, by then known as Deathwind, would give a small, cold smile. It felt like the beginning, he'd say, just the beginning. The bullet scar on his chest would remain for life, a constant reminder of the day everything changed. The wound healed, but something inside Lewis Wetszel never did, and the frontier would soon learn just how dangerous that made him. Because you see, the wilderness wasn't just a place to young Lewis Wetszel, it became his hunting ground. He read the land like a book, knew the rivers, the trees, the wind. But beauty meant nothing when death was waiting right around the corner, and nowhere was safe. The frontier had taught Lewis its harshest lesson. Mercy was a luxury no one could afford, and he'd proved to be its most dedicated student. That night in the Wetszel cabin, as Lewis recovered from his wound, a storm lashed at the walls. His father sat beside the fire, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind howl through the trees. "You did good, son," John Wetszel said quietly. "But this war isn't over." Lewis stared into the flames, his young face already losing its softness. "I know," he replied. "I know." He didn't yet realize that he would become the most feared man on the frontier, or that his war would last a lifetime. But something had awakened in him, something that would soon earn him the name that made warriors tremble. Deathwind was coming. The dark cabin walls faded into the first hint of dawn. Louis Wetzel's eyes snapped open, already alert. 5 years had passed since his capture and escape, and sleep never came easy anymore. Not with the memories, not with the war. By 1782, the American Revolution was drawing to a close far to the east, but here on the Ohio frontier the fighting only intensified. The cabin that Louis shared with his family had become a fortress. Gun ports carved between logs, thick wooden shutters ready to slam closed at the first sign of danger. Louis sat up on his straw mattress, running a hand through his long black hair. At 19, he'd grown into a man the frontier had shaped like a weapon, lean, hard, watchful. His dark eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much, too young. Morning comes whether you want it or not, his father John would say. But Louis had been up before dawn for hours already, checking his rifle, counting ammunition, planning the day's hunt. You know what's funny about frontier fame? It doesn't happen overnight. It happens one bloody incident at a time, one story told around one fire, then another, then another. For Louis Wetzel, that reputation began with a horse. Not just any horse, a bay gelding belonging to a man named Thomas Mills. "You still up for riding out to the springs?" Mills asked, finding Louis tending to his own horse outside the fort at Wheeling. Louis eyed the older man. Mills had that look, the one settlers got when they thought the danger stories were exaggerated. Eastern folk never believed how quickly things could go sideways out here. "Native Spring? That's 9 miles out," Louis replied, his voice low. "Been signs of warriors in that area all week." Mills laughed it off. 9 miles there, 9 miles back. We'll be home by supper. Besides, my horse is still there. Tied him to a tree when I had to make a run for it last week." "You left your horse tied to a tree? For a week?" Louis stared at him, incredulous. "And you think he's still there?" Mills shrugged. "Worth checking, isn't it? That's a $30 horse." $30? More than most frontier families saw in half a year. But Louis knew what Mills was really asking. He wanted Wetzel along because the young man had already earned a reputation as someone who could spot trouble before it spotted you. "Fine," Louis finally agreed, "but we ride careful, and if I say we turn back, we turn back. No arguments." The journey out was quiet, too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Nature gone silent was never a good sign. As they approached the clearing around Native Spring, Louis held up a hand, signalling Mills to stop. There, tied to a tree just as Mills had claimed, was the bay horse, looking surprisingly healthy for an animal abandoned for days. "See?" Mills grinned. "Told you he'd still be there." But Louis wasn't looking at the horse anymore. His eyes narrowed, scanning the tree line. Something wasn't right. The horse should have broken free or been taken. No way it would still be there unless... "It's a trap," he hissed. "Don't move." Mills either didn't hear or didn't care. He nudged his horse forward, eager to reclaim his property. "Nonsense. Look, he's right there." Louis watched in horror as Mills rode into the clearing. The shot cracked through the air before he could shout another warning. Mills toppled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. In that frozen moment, Louis made a choice that would define him, not to run for the fort, but to fight. As war cries erupted from the forest, he wheeled his horse and bolted, but not towards safety. He rode parallel to the tree line, drawing the ambush away from the direct path back to Wheeling. 4 warriors burst from cover, giving chase. They expected easy prey, another settler to run down. They didn't expect Louis Wetzel. Half a mile into the chase, the fastest warrior was gaining ground, tomahawk raised. Louis could hear the heavy breathing, the pounding footfalls. Without slowing his horse, he twisted in the saddle, aimed, and fired. The warrior crumpled mid-stride. "Okay, I know what you're thinking," Lewis would later tell the wide-eyed listeners at the fort. "One shot, big deal. Any decent marksman could make that hit." But what came next entered into frontier legend. Still at a full gallop, Lewis pulled his powder horn with his teeth, measured powder into his rifle barrel, spat a lead ball from his mouth into the muzzle, drove it home with his ramrod, and primed the pan. All while controlling his horse with his knees at a dead run, with 3 warriors still in pursuit. The second warrior caught up just as Lewis finished reloading. They collided, tumbling to the ground, the rifle between them. The warrior was strong, nearly tearing the gun from Lewis's grip. In the desperate struggle, Lewis twisted the barrel upward, jammed it under the man's chin, and pulled the trigger. 2 down. The last pair of pursuers hesitated, suddenly uncertain. This was not going according to plan. Lewis used their moment of doubt to reload again, the movements now mechanical, practiced to perfection. He slowed his pace, almost daring them forward. One ducked behind a tree, but chose poorly. The trunk wasn't wide enough to shield him completely. Lewis's rifle cracked again, and the warrior staggered, blood blossoming across his chest. The last warrior turned and ran, screaming something in his language. Lewis didn't bother to translate. He understood the message well enough. "No chase that man," Lewis told his audience, mimicking the heavy accent of a warrior. "Him gun always loaded." The settlers at Wheeling laughed nervously at his imitation, but the story spread. 3 warriors dead, 1 fleeing in terror, and Mills avenged. All because Lewis Wetszel could do what nobody else could: reload a rifle at a dead run. That night, back at the fort, an old hunter cornered Lewis by the fire. "That trick with the reload," the man said, lowering his voice. "How'd you figure it?" Lewis stared into the flames. "Practice. Every day since I was 14. Miles and miles through the woods, running full tilt, reloading over and over until my hands bled." The old man whistled low. "Why push yourself that hard?" Lewis's eyes reflected the firelight, dark and haunted. "Because someday my life would depend on it, and today it did." What Lewis didn't say was that he'd started practicing the day after his escape, that for 5 years he'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Revenge wasn't a hot flash for Lewis Wetszel. It was a cold, patient river. By summer of 1786, that river had carved a deep channel through the frontier. Native raids intensified as settlers pushed farther into hunting territories. A settler had been killed at Mingo Bottom, and retaliation came swift. Major McMahon gathered men at the fort, his face grim. $100 for the first native scalp brought in, he announced. To some settlers it was a fortune, a temptation worth the risk. To Lewis, who now spent more time in the forest than in civilization, the money meant nothing. He wasn't in it for payment. "I came to hunt natives," he told McMahon flatly. "Now that I've found them, I'm not going home sucking my thumb. I'm taking a scalp, or I'm losing my own." On August 5th, they crossed the Ohio, pushing toward the Muskingum River where native encampments had been spotted. 5 scouts moved ahead and found the enemy camp. Too many warriors, no chance of victory. The decision came quick: retreat. But Lewis Wetszel didn't move. Sitting on a log, rifle across his knees, he looked up at McMahon. "You all go on," he said quietly. "I came here for a reason." "Don't be a fool, Wetszel," McMahon growled. "There's 50 warriors in that camp." "Then I'll find one alone." They left him there, one man against the wilderness, surrounded by enemies who wanted nothing more than to count coup on the settler they'd come to call Long Knife for his deadly blade work. Lewis didn't care. His only friend was his rifle, his only guide the stars. As darkness fell, he moved with the silence of a hunting cat, sticking to deep woods, avoiding war parties and main trails. No fire for him that night, no warm meal, no light. Instead, he dug a small pit, buried dry bark under dirt, and let it smoulder beneath him for warmth. No smoke, no flame, no sign a man was there. Picture that for a second. Lying on your stomach all night over a hole filled with smouldering bark, dirt around you, mosquitoes whining in your ears, every twig snap potentially death approaching. Not exactly the Hilton, right? The next evening, Lewis found what he was looking for, 2 warriors making camp along a creek bed. Wetszel melted into the brush and waited. Patience was his strongest weapon. At sunset, one warrior returned from hunting, stoked the fire and cooked his meal. The second arrived shortly after. They laughed, talked, sang, completely at ease in their territory. They had no idea Lewis Wetszel was 20 feet away, crouched in the darkness, watching. Around midnight, one stood, grabbed his rifle and a chunk of burning wood from the fire, and disappeared into the trees, probably heading to a deer lick using the smoke to keep mosquitoes at bay. Lewis cursed silently. This wasn't the plan. He'd had them both right there. Now one had slipped away. He waited, hoping the man would return, but as dawn approached he knew he couldn't wait longer. The remaining warrior was curled on his side, deep in sleep. Lewis moved forward, silent as death itself. His knife found its mark with deadly precision. A single jolt, a final breath, then silence. "I won't tell you what happened next," Lewis would later say, his voice dropping to where listeners had to lean in. "Some things aren't for telling around fires where children might hear." He left his mark, wiped his blade clean, and vanished before the sun broke the horizon. By the time he reached Mingo Bottom, his companions had already returned empty-handed, but Lewis came back with what he'd promised, and claimed the reward no one thought he'd earn. "Just another day's work," he shrugged when they asked how he'd managed it alone. But the settlers knew better. The man they were beginning to whisper about wasn't just skilled, he was something else entirely, something the frontier hadn't seen before. The native warriors had a name for him now: Deathwind, a shadow in the trees, a ghost with a rifle, a hunter of men. The name spread through villages faster than forest fire, carried on frightened voices. "He moves without sound," they said, "strikes without warning, vanishes like morning mist." By 1786, Lewis Wetszel knew the frontier like no other. Every creek bend, every ridge, every hidden cave. The land was his almanac, his map, his weapon. He read wind direction by watching grass tips sway, found water by following certain insects, stayed hidden by walking on rocks and hanging from branches to leave no trail. The frontier had 1,000 deadly tricks, and Wetszel knew them all. One of the deadliest was the turkey call, a technique native hunters used to lure both wild turkeys and unwary settlers into ambush. More than once, men had disappeared after hearing a lone turkey cry echoing from the woods. Lewis had his suspicions and set out to prove it. East of Wheeling Creek, 60 feet above the water, he found a cave nearly hidden by vines. From inside, a hunter could see across the hills, a perfect ambush point. "See how the ground's worn smooth at the entrance," he explained to a young settler he was training. "Too regular for animals. And look there, faint smoke stains on the ceiling. Someone's been using this place." The cave was a blind, a graveyard in waiting. The frontier had its killers, but Wetszel was better at the game than most. Before dawn the next morning he slipped through the brush, circling wide to approach the cave from behind. He picked his spot, a clear view of the entrance hidden in shadows, and then he waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally a warrior's head rose from the cave mouth, eyes scanning the trees. The man let out a sharp cry, the perfect imitation of a wild turkey. Wetzel's rifle was already up, his breath steady. One smooth pull of the trigger, and the shot cracked through the forest. The warrior dropped instantly, body collapsing against the rock behind him. "That turkey won't be calling any more," Wetzel remarked when he returned to the settlement. Whether others used the cave again, no one knew. But Wetzel had made his point. Every fall Lewis made his own kind of hunt, deep into enemy territory, alone, armed, and looking for trouble. Not for furs or game, but for scalps and revenge. The frontier had become a brutal classroom, and he'd graduated to master. This time he pushed to the Muskingum and found what he sought. A small native camp, 4 warriors fast asleep around a dying fire. He crouched in the darkness, assessing the odds, 4 to 1. Tough, but not impossible. Midnight came. A wolf howled in the distance. Then, like a shadow, Wetzel moved, rifle in one hand, tomahawk in the other. He set the rifle against a tree, drew his knife and stepped forward. Silent, cold, lethal. His blade struck true. The first man never made a sound before collapsing. A second step, a second stroke, and another fell without waking. The third barely had time to gasp before Wetzel's blade silenced him. The fourth ran. Lewis gave chase, but darkness swallowed the man whole. When Lewis returned to the settlement weeks later, someone asked if he'd had any luck on his hunt. "Not much," he replied with a shrug. "Treed 4 natives, 1 got away." As if he were talking about squirrels, not men. 70 miles out, 70 miles back, just another day's work. That casual brutality shocked even hardened frontiersmen, but they understood its roots. In a world where mercy often meant death, Lewis Wetzel had simply stripped away pretense. He was what the frontier created, its darkest reflection. "You think I'm cruel," he once told a minister who questioned his methods. "You haven't seen what I've seen. You haven't buried friends with their scalps torn off, or found children." He stopped, jaw tight. There's no room for halfway measures out here. One night, caught in a storm near Wheeling, Lewis took shelter in an abandoned cabin. He climbed into the loft, gathered a few broken boards for a bed, and settled in. Then came movement below. 6 native warriors entered, lit a fire, and started cooking. Lewis, knife in hand, didn't move. If they spotted him, he had one chance: drop into the middle of them and fight his way out. He steadied his breath, muscles coiled, ready. But they never looked up. One by one they finished eating and stretched out by the fire. Soon their breathing deepened into sleep. Lewis didn't hesitate. He crawled from the loft, slipped into the shadows, pressed himself against the logs near the door, fingers tight around his blade. Now it was his turn to hunt. At dawn, a warrior stepped outside, stretching in the cool morning air. He never saw it coming. Wetzel's rifle cracked, the warrior crumpled, and by the time the sound faded, Lewis was gone, slipping into the wild. "You know what the strangest thing is," he later told a wide-eyed young settler. "The quiet after, when the shot echoes away and there's nothing but wind in the trees again, like the world's already forgotten what just happened." By 1788, Lewis Wetzel had become more legend than man. Settlers spoke of him in hushed tones, their protector, their avenger, the one-man native warriors feared above all others. In their telling, he could track a ghost across bare rock, shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 paces, and appear like smoke wherever danger threatened. But legends cast long shadows, and Louis Wetzel's was about to collide with a changing frontier, one where military authority was replacing frontier justice, and where the line between protector and murderer had begun to blur. To the settlers who counted on him, he was a hero. To the military men pushing westward with dreams of peace treaties, he was becoming something else entirely, a problem. And Louis Wetzel didn't take kindly to being called a problem. A cold wind blew down from the north as autumn painted the frontier in fire colours. Louis stood at the edge of the forest, watching smoke rise from the chimneys of Wheeling. He could walk back to civilization, back to warm hearths and admiring eyes, or he could turn again to the wilderness that had claimed his soul years ago. His hand drifted to the rifle scar on his chest, the mark that had started it all. Sometimes he wondered who he might have been without it. Just another settler, perhaps, a farmer, a husband, a father. But the wind whispered a different truth as it stirred his long black hair. He was none of those things. He was Deathwind now, and the hunt was never finished. Louis turned away from the settlement and faced the endless forest. Winter was coming, but he'd survived worse. The wilderness opened before him, dark and secret and waiting. He disappeared into the trees without looking back. Dawn broke cold and grey over Fort Harmar. The military outpost stood at the confluence of the Muskingum and Ohio rivers, a symbol of American authority pushing into the wilderness. Inside the fort's walls, order and discipline reigned, a stark contrast to the chaotic frontier beyond. At age 25, Louis Wetzel found himself in this alien world of straight lines and strict rules. He'd reluctantly agreed to try soldiering under General Josiah Harmar. It was 1788, and the American government was attempting to establish control over its western territories, making treaties with native tribes and enforcing a new kind of law. Louis hated every minute of it. "Stand up straight, Wetzel," the drill sergeant barked. "This ain't the woods. We have standards here." Louis stared back with those dark, unnerving eyes that never seemed to blink enough. The eyes that had watched men die, that had seen through forest shadows at 100 paces. "Yes," he replied flatly. "I can see your standards." Wait, I need to pause here because this whole situation is wild when you think about it. Imagine taking the deadliest frontier fighter, a man who'd spent years basically waging a one-man war, and trying to make him follow military protocol. It's like trying to put a wolf in a dog collar and expecting it to heal. The real trouble started when a delegation of Native Americans arrived at Fort Harmar. General Harmar was negotiating peace treaties, trying to end the cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives on both sides of the frontier. Among the visiting native leaders was a warrior named George Washington. Yeah, you heard that right. Some Native Americans had taken to adopting English names, sometimes as a diplomatic gesture. This particular warrior was respected, trusted by both sides, and instrumental to Harmar's peace efforts. Louis Wetzel watched the proceedings with thinly veiled contempt. To him, treaties were just paper promises that would be broken at the first opportunity. He'd seen too many raids, too many bodies, to believe peace was possible. "You know, they're just buying time," he muttered to another soldier as they stood guard. "First chance they get, they'll be back with war parties." The soldier shifted uncomfortably. "Orders are orders, Wetzel. General wants peace. We give him peace." Louis's lip curled slightly. "Peace doesn't grow in this soil. Not anymore." 3 days into the negotiations, Louis Wetszel disappeared from the fort. Nobody thought much of it. He often vanished for hours, preferring the forest to the confines of military life. But that evening, a shot cracked through the air just beyond the fort's walls. Soldiers rushed to investigate and found the native leader, George Washington, lying dead, a bullet through his chest, and Louis Wetszel, rifle still warm, standing nearby. The outrage was instant. General Harmar had him arrested and clapped in irons before the body was even cold. In the stockade, Louis sat calmly, those unnerving eyes focused on middle distance. "Do you deny shooting the man?" Harmar demanded. "No," Louis answered simply. "He was here under my protection, under a flag of truce. You've endangered everything we're working for." Louis looked up then, and the cold fury in his eyes made even the general step back. "Protection?" Louis's voice was soft, dangerous. "Where was your protection when my family was butchered? Where was your protection for the settlers who've been living in terror while you play politics? This isn't the wilderness anymore, Wetszel. This is becoming a nation of laws." "Laws?" Louis nearly spat the word. "Your laws mean nothing out there. They don't stop tomahawks. They don't keep children from being taken." Their conversation was witnessed by a young lieutenant who would later write, "I never saw such hatred in a man's eyes as burned in Wetzel's that day. It was like looking into the eyes of something not entirely human anymore, something the wilderness had claimed and remade in its own savage image." When questioned further about his motives, Louis offered a solution that shocked even hardened frontier officers. "Turn me over to them," he suggested, voice eerily calm. "Put their best warriors in a circle. Let them have tomahawks. I'll take one too. Let's see who walks away." Harmar refused. "This isn't the frontier, Wetszel. This is the army. The law will decide your fate." Days passed in the stockade. Louis paced like a caged wolf, 11 steps one way, 11 back. The walls closed in on him. The chains weighed on his spirit more than his wrists. He sent a message to Harmar. "I can't live like this. Let me walk." Perhaps seeing the dangerous madness growing in his prisoner's eyes, Harmar relented slightly. Louis's feet were freed, but his hands remained shackled. He was allowed to walk the grounds under guard, a small taste of freedom. That was all he needed. At first he played it subtle. He'd dart a few steps away, laugh, then stop. The guards relaxed, thinking he was just stretching his legs, working off restlessness. Each time he pushed a little farther. Then one day, with no warning, Louis exploded into motion. Despite the iron shackles on his wrists, he ran with the preternatural speed that had saved his life countless times before. The guards hesitated, then fired. Too late. He was already in the trees, a shadow vanishing into deeper shadow. The hunt was on. Soldiers and native scouts swept the forest, searching for the fugitive. Hours passed as Louis Wetszel, still in chains, evaded some of the best trackers on the frontier. Miles from the fort, he slipped beneath a fallen tree, pressing his body into the earth. Barely breathing, he listened as search parties passed. At one point, 2 native scouts actually climbed onto the very log hiding him. He couldn't have gotten far, one said in his language, not realizing Louis understood every word. Not with chains. They howled for others, searching in widening circles but never looked close enough. As night fell, they moved on, convinced he must have gone another way. Now came the real challenge. The Ohio River stood between Louis and safety. The banks were swarming with guards. Fort Harmar controlled the crossing points. His only hope was a friend's cabin on the Virginia side, but how to reach it? No raft, no boat, just open water and iron shackles. I'd rather drown than go back, he decided. In the darkness, he slipped into the mighty Ohio. The current dragged at him, but he kicked hard, floating on his back, inching across. The weight of the shackles threatened to pull him under with every movement. By the time he crawled onto the Virginia shore, he collapsed, barely able to move. Eventually he made his way to his friend's cabin. A hammer and file freed him from the irons, and for the moment he was safe. But General Harmar wasn't finished. Furious over Wetzel's escape, he sent men in a canoe to drag him back. Wetzel and his allies were waiting as the boat neared the shore. Rifles levelled from the bank, the warning was simple: step out and you die. Harmar's men considered their options, then wisely turned around. They reported back that capturing Louis Wetzel from among his people would be like dragging Old Horny out of the bottomless pit. Frontier speak for pulling the devil himself from hell. With fresh weapons and supplies, Louis headed home, but the price on his head kept climbing. Captain Kingsbury was next to try. He moved on Mingo Bottom, expecting an easy capture. He was dead wrong. The settlers, upon hearing that soldiers were coming for their protector, were in no mood for legal niceties. "They're talking about hanging a man for killing a native," one settler growled, checking his rifle. "Next they'll be telling us we can't defend our own homes." The plan was simple. Ambush Kingsbury's boat and leave no survivors. Frontier justice at its most brutal. It took Major McMahon, the same officer who'd once offered a bounty for native scalps, to stop them. He warned Kingsbury straight. Try to take Wetzel, and he'd have every settler in the region gunning for him. Kingsbury got the message and turned back. Louis figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. Downriver in Maysville, Kentucky, Louis stopped for a drink at a tavern, thinking himself beyond Harmar's reach. That's when trouble found him again. A lieutenant named Lawler, passing through with soldiers, spotted the infamous Wetzel. Unlike Kingsbury, Lawler didn't bother with threats or negotiation. He rounded up his men, stormed the tavern, and threw Wetzel in irons once more. No trial, no warning, just cold steel and a hard shove onto a boat bound for Fort Washington. By nightfall, Louis sat in a cell, bound hand and foot like a common criminal. The news hit the frontier like lightning. Captured for killing a native. Outrage exploded up and down the Ohio. Every settlement bristled with loaded rifles as petitions poured in demanding his release. When Harmar ignored them, men started forming militias. They weren't asking anymore. They were preparing to take Wetzel back by force. Harmar saw the writing on the wall. He wasn't about to start a war with his own countrymen over one man, no matter how notorious. Wetzel walked free, returning to the settlements a hero. His list of kills proof of his courage, the persecution only making him more beloved. As for General Harmar, his reputation never recovered. He had tried and failed to leash Deathwind. No one ever tried again. If Harmar had even half of Wetzel's nerve, settlers would say around their fires, his men might not have been slaughtered in the Miami campaign. They weren't wrong. Harmar's later military efforts against native forces would end in disaster. But Louis didn't waste time on failures, his own or anyone else's. The wilderness called him back, and he answered as he always did, with rifle in hand and vengeance in heart. You see, while the conflict with Harmar was happening, something else was spreading through the frontier. Louis Wetzel's techniques, the tricks that kept him alive, the methods that made him deadly. "Show me how you reload while running," young men would beg when they caught him in rare sociable moments. Louis would demonstrate his movements so fluid they seemed impossible. "Start with small lead balls," he'd explain. "Carry them in your mouth, 3 or 4 at a time. Pour powder as you run, spit the ball in, ram it home. Practice until you can do it blind. Isn't the lead poisonous? Someone would inevitably ask. Lewis would just shrug. Probably. Better than being dead. What most didn't realise was the price Lewis paid for his skills. His teeth were worn from years of holding lead balls. His hands bore scars from countless reload drills gone wrong. The powder residue had blackened his fingers permanently. Even his hearing had suffered from the thousands of shots fired without protection. "How do you move so quiet?" others would ask. "Watch deer," he'd reply. "See how they place each foot, how they test the ground before putting their weight down. Do that, and wear moccasins, not those clumsy boots." But the most valuable lessons weren't about weapons or movement. They were about reading the land. "The forest talks to you," he once told a group of young scouts. "Rain washes away tracks, but look at the moss on rocks. It gets disturbed when someone passes and takes days to settle back. Birds fly a certain way when startled by a man, different from when they spot a fox or bear. Spider webs across a trail. If they're broken, someone came through recently." These observations weren't just wilderness poetry. They were survival intelligence that kept people alive. By teaching others, Lewis Wetszel was doing more than creating followers. He was ensuring his methods would outlive him. Every fall, as leaves turned to flame across the hills, Lewis would disappear into native territories. Weeks later he'd return, sometimes with scalps, sometimes with just stories. But always he came back changed, a little harder, a little more distant from the civilization he nominally protected. "What do you see out there?" a preacher once asked him. "What keeps drawing you back?" Lewis considered the question longer than expected. "Freedom," he finally answered. "Out there, everything is honest. The wolf doesn't pretend to be anything but a wolf. The hawk doesn't apologize for killing. There's truth in that kind of world." "And is that what you want to be? A wolf? A hawk?" Lewis's eyes reflected something ancient. "I want to be whatever keeps my people alive." That answer troubled many who heard it later, because Lewis Wetszel had crossed lines that, once crossed, changed a man forever. He had become something the frontier created but civilization couldn't contain. A weapon shaped by necessity but increasingly uncomfortable to acknowledge. To the Shawnee and other tribes he wasn't just another long knife. He was Zika Wikenha, Deathwind itself. Children were hushed with his name. Warriors set extra guards when travelling through his hunting grounds. His reputation had grown beyond the man into something mythic. "They say he can smell a native from a mile away," settlers would whisper. "They say he never sleeps, just waits with open eyes." Lewis never bothered correcting these tall tales. Let them believe what they wanted. Fear was a weapon too. The summer of 1789 brought a drought that turned the Ohio Valley to dust. Crops withered in the fields, game grew scarce, and tensions rose as resources dwindled. Native raids increased as hunting grounds yielded less food. In response, Lewis organized his own kind of defense, teaching settlers to fortify cabins, establish warning systems, and most importantly, to strike first when trouble seemed imminent. "Don't wait for them to attack," he instructed at a meeting of homesteaders. "If you see signs they're in the area, find them before they find you." Some were uncomfortable with this approach, too close to murder for their Christian sensibilities. "Hesitation gets you killed," Lewis reminded them coldly. "They won't hesitate." His methods were brutal but effective. Settlements, he advised, suffered fewer raids, lost fewer lives. Results spoke louder than moral qualms, and his influence grew. But there was a price for this security. Louis Wetszel was becoming something removed from those he protected. He spent more time in the forest than in cabins, spoke more to trees than to people. The wilderness had claimed him so completely that some wondered if he could ever truly return. "I saw him yesterday," a woman told her neighbour at the well, standing at the edge of the clearing watching the children play. But the look in his eyes, it wasn't like he was seeing them at all, like he was looking at something none of us could see. The neighbour nodded. "My husband says Wetszel doesn't really live here anymore. Says his body might walk among us, but his soul's out there in the dark woods." By 1790, Louis Wetszel had become more than a man. He was a legend, a shadow, a warning. To those who depended on him, he was still their protector. But to those who studied him closely, he had transformed into something else, a mirror reflecting the darkest, truths of frontier life back at those who would rather not see them. One cool autumn evening, as settlers gathered for a harvest celebration, someone noticed Louis standing apart from the crowd, watching the dancing and laughter with that unsettling stillness he'd perfected. A brave soul approached him. "Why not join us, Louis? You've earned some joy." Louis looked at the man, then back at the celebration. Firelight gleamed on happy faces, on children who'd never known anything but the frontier, on women who'd survived its harshest tests. "This is why," he said simply, gesturing to the scene. "This is what it's for." Then he turned and walked back into the gathering darkness, a shadow returning to shadows, the Deathwind moving on to wherever it was needed next. The howl of a wolf echoed from distant hills, a sound most settlers feared. But as Louis Wetszel disappeared into the night, more than one person wondered if, to him, it sounded like home. The year 1791 brought no peace to the Ohio frontier. If anything, the violence intensified as native tribes formed stronger alliances against the tide of settlement. The line between victim and aggressor had long since blurred into a smear of blood that stained both sides. Louis Wetszel, now 28, had become something of a ghost, appearing when needed, vanishing when pursued, materializing out of forest shadows to deliver either salvation or death, depending on which side of the frontier you stood. Did you hear about Wetzel's latest? The question circulated around fort firesides and cabin hearths, like its own form of currency. Each tale added to the legend, each whispered story reinforced the myth. One morning in early spring, Louis was travelling with a young relative near Dunkard Creek. The journey had been easy so far, too easy, setting off warning bells in Louis's mind. He'd developed a sixth sense for trouble that had kept him alive while others fell. When they arrived at their destination, a homestead belonging to family friends, they found only charred ruins. "Stay back," Louis warned, dropping to a crouch at the edge of the clearing. His eyes scanned the ground, reading the story written in trampled grass and scattered belongings. The young man with him gasped at the destruction. What happened here? Was it natives? Louis ignored the question, his focus absolute as he studied the ground. He moved in a wide circle around the burned cabin, stopping occasionally to examine marks invisible to untrained eyes. 3 natives, he finally said, voice flat. 1 white man and a woman. He pointed to a delicate impression in a patch of mud. Small shoe print. The captive's a young woman. The colour drained from his companion's face. "It's her," he whispered. "My fiancée was staying here." Louis straightened, eyes already calculating distances, directions, probabilities. "If they're heading for the river, we can cut them off. Let's go now." The young man started toward the trees, but Louis caught his arm. Rush him blind and you'll just get her killed." His voice was hard. "They've tried to hide their trail. See how they walked through that rocky patch? How they use the stream to mask their scent? These aren't random raiders. They know what they're doing." "Then how will we find them?" Lewis's mouth thinned to a grim line. "Because I'm not tracking their feet. I'm tracking their minds." Instead of following footprints, Lewis angled toward a distant ridgeline. They're thinking like hunted animals now. They'll take the path that offers the most cover, the quickest route to safety. That means the Ohio crossing at Miller's Ford. They pushed hard, eating jerky on the move, stopping only when absolutely necessary. By nightfall, thick clouds had choked the moon, forcing them to wait. "We'll lose 'em in the dark," the young man fretted. "Better to wait than blunder into an ambush," Lewis replied. "First light, we move." That night, as they huddled under a crude shelter of branches, the young man asked the question that had been weighing on him. "Do you think she's still alive?" Lewis stared into the darkness. They took her instead of killing her. That means they want her alive. He didn't add the many reasons why. Some truths were better left unspoken. At dawn they picked up the chase, coming off a ridge into untouched valley land. Then, in soft earth near a stream crossing, they found what they needed. Tracks, among them a small shoe print. The young man stiffened. "That's hers," he said, voice thick with emotion. They followed persistently over hills and streams, the trail barely visible but never lost. By sunset they reached the Ohio River. Across the water, firelight blinked against the gathering darkness. The girl was still alive. "Let's go now," the young man urged, already moving toward the water. Lewis caught him again. "We wait for daylight," he instructed. "Attack in the dark, and we're just as likely to hit her as them. But listen to me." Lewis's voice was a razor wrapped in cloth. "I've done this before. You haven't. We do it my way, or we both die and she stays captive. Understand?" The night passed with excruciating slowness. Neither man slept much, Lewis occasionally rising to check the distant campfire, making sure their quarry hadn't moved on. At first light they slipped into the Ohio River, swimming silently across the wide channel. On the far bank they paused to check their weapons. Water dripped from the barrels of their rifles. They'd have to dry them quickly or risk misfires. The camp was just stirring as the sun crested the hills. Lewis surveyed the scene through a screen of leaves. 3 native warriors, 1 white renegade, and the girl, bound but unharmed, sitting near the remains of the fire. "You take the white one," Lewis whispered, his rifle already trained. "I'll take the nearest warrior. After we fire, they'll scatter, reload fast, and be ready for anything." The young man nodded, hands trembling slightly as he aimed. 2 shots cracked almost as one. 2 bodies fell. The young man ran to free his fiancée while Lewis reloaded, eyes never leaving the tree line where the others had fled. He needed to know if more waited in the woods. Lewis fired once, high into the trees, a shot no marksman would waste unless he was trying to provoke a reaction. It worked. The warriors sprang out screaming, tomahawks raised, thinking they had their enemy cornered and out of ammunition. They were wrong. Lewis didn't run, didn't flinch. He simply reloaded with that preternatural speed he'd perfected. 1 warrior was nearly on him when Lewis spun and fired. The man dropped instantly. The last attacker came harder, certain Wetszel couldn't possibly reload again in time. But Lewis moved like water, ducking between trees, his hands smooth and practiced. When his rifle was ready, he stopped, turned, and fired. The warrior fell mid-stride, and just like that, it was over. 4 men dead, a captive rescued, all before most people had eaten their morning meal. "My God," the young woman whispered, staring at Lewis with a mixture of gratitude and horror. "You killed them all without even blinking." Lewis checked his rifle, already thinking about the journey home. "Blinking gets you killed out here," he replied. That night, as they made camp safely on the Virginia side of the river, the young couple huddled together near the fire while Lewis kept watch from the shadows. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing his way. "Is he always like this?" the young woman asked, not realizing how well sound carried in the night air. "Like what?" "So empty, like there's nothing inside him but death." Her fiancé looked toward the darkness where their rescuer sat motionless. "I don't think he's empty," he said slowly. "I think he's full of ghosts." Lewis heard them but gave no sign. Their words meant nothing. Only survival mattered. Theirs, his, the continuation of what he'd sworn to protect. If that meant becoming the monster that haunted both sides' nightmares, so be it. By 1792, Lewis Wetzel's reputation had spread far beyond the Ohio frontier. In Kentucky, land speculators heard the stories and saw opportunity, a legendary scout who could guide them safely through hostile territory. One of these speculators was John Madison, brother to future President James Madison. Madison needed to survey lands along the Kanawha River, deep in contested territory. He offered Lewis good money to serve as guide and protector. "I don't come cheap," Lewis warned when they met at a tavern in Wheeling. Madison smiled confidently, the smile of a man used to buying whatever he needed. "I'm prepared to pay top dollar for the best, and from what I hear, that's you." Lewis studied him, well-dressed, smooth-handed, Eastern-educated, the kind of man who made decisions that shaped the frontier without ever having to bleed for it. "It's not just about money," Lewis said finally. "If we go my way. When I say move, you move. When I say hide, you hide. No questions, no arguments." Madison's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not accustomed to taking orders from hired help," Lewis finished for him. "That's fine. Find someone else." He stood to leave. "Wait," Madison said quickly. "I apologize. Your terms are acceptable." 3 days later, they set out with a small party. Madison, Lewis, 2 survey assistants, and a pack handler. The journey started well enough, following the Ohio south before turning up the Kanawha. Lewis moved ahead of the group, constantly scanning for signs of trouble, occasionally disappearing into the forest for hours before returning silently, materializing beside Madison without warning. "Must you do that?" Madison snapped after nearly falling from his horse when Lewis appeared from nowhere. "Do what?" Lewis asked. "Appear like a ghost. It's unsettling." Lewis's expression didn't change. Being predictable gets you killed out here. Better unsettled than dead. On the 4th day, they found an abandoned camp. Blankets, tools, supplies left behind in obvious haste. Lewis examined everything carefully, reading the signs others missed. Whoever was here left in a hurry less than 2 days ago, he concluded. No blood, no signs of attack. Just panic. Madison eyed the supplies greedily. "Well, their loss is our gain. We can use these." Lewis frowned but didn't argue. They needed the supplies, and whoever had fled was long gone. They took what they needed and moved on. That afternoon, crossing the Little Kanawha River, gunfire erupted from the surrounding hills. A hidden war party had ambushed them. Lewis hit the ground instantly, dragging Madison down with him as bullets splintered bark above their heads. 2 of their companions weren't so lucky. The surveyor's assistant took a ball to the chest. dead before he hit the water. Madison wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't a coward either. He drew his pistol, ready to stand his ground. "We can fight them off," he shouted over the gunfire. Lewis grabbed his shoulder. "There's at least 20 of them. We'll be overrun in minutes. We can't just run." "Actually, we can." Lewis pointed to a narrow ravine. "That way. Now. Don't stop for anything." Madison hesitated, looking back at his fallen companion. "He's dead," Lewis said flatly. "You want to join him?" A bullet kicked up dirt at their feet, deciding the matter. They ran, ducking into the ravine as war whoops filled the air behind them. Lewis led them through a maze of gullies and rock formations, doubling back, crossing streams, using every trick he knew to break their trail. By nightfall, they'd lost their pursuers, but also the rest of their party. It was just Lewis and Madison now, deep in hostile territory with minimal supplies. "We need to circle back," Madison insisted. "Find the others." Lewis shook his head. "They're either dead or scattered. Our best chance is to keep moving east, reach the settlements." "You're just going to abandon them." Madison's voice rose with disbelief. "I'm going to get you out alive. That's what you paid for." Lewis's voice was cold, pragmatic. "We move at first light. Try to sleep." Madison stared at him. "How can you be so callous? Those were men back there, men with families." Lewis looked up from checking his rifle. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't seen hundreds die out here? Crying over them won't bring them back. Learning from them might keep you alive. What could I possibly learn from their deaths? That this land doesn't care about your plans, your money, or your name. Out here you're just meat walking. Remember that, and you might make it home." They travelled for 3 more days, living off the land, Lewis trapping small game, finding edible plants, moving with the stealth and efficiency that had kept him alive for so many years. Madison watched and learned, his initial disdain gradually shifting to grudging respect. On the 4th night, as they huddled in a cave during a thunderstorm, Madison broke their usual silence. "Why do you do it, Wetszel? You could have a farm, a family. Instead you live like this." He gestured to their meagre shelter. Lewis was quiet so long that Madison thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the cave mouth. "I had 14 summers when they took me, shot me, dragged me away. My brother too." He touched the scar on his chest absently. "You never forget that feeling. Being prey, never being safe, never knowing if you'll see another dawn." Madison waited, sensing there was more. "When we escaped, I made a choice. Never prey again. Never." Lewis's voice hardened. "This life, it's not what I wanted. It's what I needed to become." "And what is that exactly?" Lewis met his eyes, and Madison fought the urge to look away. "Whatever stands between my people and slaughter." They reached a settlement 3 days later. Madison immediately sought out paper and ink, eager to record the journey. "I'll be sure to mention your role prominently in my report," he told Lewis, as they prepared to part ways. "Your methods may be unconventional, but your effectiveness is undeniable." Lewis checked the prime on his rifle, already thinking about the return journey. "Don't bother, just pay me what we agreed." "You don't care about recognition?" "Recognition just makes you a target." Lewis shouldered his pack. "I prefer shadows." As the settlement disappeared behind him, Lewis felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Towns, people, politics, they all felt like constraints, ropes trying to bind him. The forest ahead promised freedom, danger, purpose. It was where he belonged now. That evening, camped beside a small stream, Lewis allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation. Madison's question lingered. Why this life? He had no simple answer. The wilderness had claimed him as surely as he had claimed it. The frontier had written its harsh code into his bones, and he could no more reject it than he could stop breathing. In quieter moments, he sometimes wondered what kind of man he might have been in peacetime. A farmer, a tradesman, a husband and father. The thoughts came less frequently now, the alternate Lewis Wetszel fading like mist under strong sunlight. There was only Deathwind now, moving silent through the trees, a natural force like storm or flood. Neither good nor evil, just necessary. The next morning Lewis found fresh tracks near his camp. 5 warriors, moving fast, heading toward the very settlement he'd just left. Without hesitation, he changed course to follow. Madison and the others would have to look after themselves for now. The hunt was calling, and as always, Lewis Wetszel answered. "The White Devil follows," one warrior would later tell his chief after escaping the ambush that killed his companions. "He is not a man. He is a spirit that feeds on death." The settlers never knew how close danger had come, or that a shadow had turned it aside once more. But Lewis preferred it that way. Recognition, as he'd told Madison, only made you a target. And Lewis Wetszel had been a target long enough to know he'd rather be the hunter. Winter came early to the Ohio Valley in 1793. The first snow fell before the harvest was complete, and the settlements hunkered down for what promised to be a brutal season. Inside Fort Henry, families gathered close to hearths, telling stories to pass the long, dark evenings. Lewis Wetzel's name featured in many of those tales, but the man himself was nowhere to be found. "Heard he's gone south," one settler remarked, warming his hands over the fire. "Said the frontier's getting too crowded for his taste." Another laughed. "Crowded? We're still outnumbered 10-1 by hostiles." "Not for Wetzel's type of crowded. Man needs space to breathe. Space without rules." They weren't wrong. As 1794 dawned, Lewis Wetszel, now 31, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the changing frontier. It wasn't just the growing number of settlements springing up along the Ohio. It was the nature of those settlements. More organized, more governed, more civilized. The wilderness was being tamed, and men like Lewis were becoming anachronisms, respected, feared, but increasingly out of place. So Lewis did what he'd always done when uncomfortable. He moved. South this time, following the great rivers down to their ultimate destination. New Orleans beckoned, a chaotic, lawless port town where a man with Lewis's particular skills might find opportunity. The journey down the Ohio and Mississippi took months. Lewis travelled by flatboat, one of hundreds making the journey that year. The rivers were the highways of the frontier, carrying goods, people, and stories, downstream to the waiting markets of the Delta. For once, Lewis wasn't alone. The flatboats travelled in loose convoys for safety, carrying families, traders, and adventurers. Around evening fires, tales were shared, and invariably someone would mention the Indian fighters of the Ohio country. "Wetzel? Yeah, I heard of him," a Kentucky boatman said one night. "They say he can track a ghost across bare rock." Lewis, sitting quietly at the edge of the circle, said nothing. Let them tell their stories. The legend was more useful than the man anyway. As they floated farther south, the landscape changed dramatically. The dense hardwood forests of the Ohio gave way to cypress swamps and bayous, terrain unlike anything Lewis had known before. The air grew thick and wet, heavy with unfamiliar scents. "Like breathing through a warm, wet blanket, isn't it?" a fellow traveller commented, noticing Lewis's discomfort with the humidity. Lewis nodded, scanning the shoreline. New dangers lurked here. Alligators instead of wolves, water moccasins instead of copperheads, diseases that could kill a man faster than any arrow. Different kind of wilderness, Lewis observed, but still wilderness. New Orleans in 1794 was a study in contrasts, French elegance alongside frontier rawness, Spanish authority attempting to control American ambition, wealthy merchants living alongside desperate criminals. The city was officially under Spanish control, but its heart remained French, and its future was clearly American. Lewis found lodging in a small boarding house near the waterfront. The city's constant noise and press of humanity made him twitchy, but the anonymity was refreshing. Here, no one knew Deathwind. He was just another frontiersman down from the Ohio country, or so he thought. "You're Wetszel, aren't you?" The question came from a well-dressed gentleman who approached Lewis at a waterfront tavern. Lewis Wetszel, the Indian fighter. Lewis's hand drifted toward his knife. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, extending his hand. "James Wilkinson, at your service. General James Wilkinson." Lewis didn't take the offered hand. Wilkinson was known even on the frontier, an ambitious military man with a reputation for complicated loyalties. Some whispered he was in Spanish pay while holding American rank. "What do you want with me, General?" Wilkinson pulled up a chair uninvited. "A man with your specialized skills might find opportunities here. New Orleans is a gateway to Mexico, to the Caribbean, to places where fortunes can be made." "I'm not for hire," Lewis replied flatly. "Everyone's for hire, Mr. Wetszel. It's just a matter of price." Wilkinson leaned closer. "Spain pays well for men who can navigate wilderness and handle delicate situations." "You're recruiting for the Spanish?" Wilkinson's smile never wavered. "I'm identifying talent that could be beneficial to various interests, including, at times, Spanish interests." Lewis stood abruptly. "I kill for my people, not for gold, not for Spain, not for you." As he walked away, Wilkinson called after him, "The frontier's changing, Wetszel. Men like you need new patrons. Think about it." Lewis didn't look back, but the words followed him. The frontier was changing. That much was true. Over the next few months, Lewis took odd jobs around New Orleans, guiding hunting parties into the bayous, providing security for merchants, occasionally working as a translator for native delegations coming to treat with Spanish authorities. His fluency in several native languages surprised those who knew him only as a killer. "How do you learn to speak Shawnee so well?" a trader asked him once. Lewis's answer was simple: "Know your enemy better than they know themselves." But the restlessness that had driven him south hadn't abated. If anything, it had grown worse. The city walls closed in on him, the political intrigues annoyed him, and the constant scrutiny of Spanish officials made him increasingly paranoid. Something had to give. And in the spring of 1795, it did. The official record is frustratingly vague on what happened next. Some accounts claim Lewis was arrested for counterfeiting Spanish currency. Others suggest an affair with a prominent Spaniard's wife. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, or possibly somewhere else entirely. What we know for certain is that Lewis Wetszel, the feared Deathwind of the Ohio frontier, found himself chained in a Spanish prison cell with no apparent way out. For a man who'd survived by keeping the wilderness at his back and enemies in front of him, imprisonment was worse than death. The walls pressed in, the chains weighed more each day, and the Louisiana heat turned his cell into a sweltering box. "How long have I been here?" he asked a guard one day, having lost track of time. 6 months, came the reply, with many more to come. Lewis looked down at his hands, once calloused from rifle and knife, now softening in captivity. His legendary hair had been cut short upon imprisonment, another indignity he couldn't forget. "What are the charges against me?" he asked. For perhaps the 100th time, the guard shrugged. "Does it matter? You're American. That's reason enough." International tensions were high. Spain controlled New Orleans but feared American expansion. Using Lewis as a political pawn made a certain cold sense. But knowing that didn't make the chains any lighter. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Lewis marked time by scratching lines on his cell wall, one for each day. Eventually he stopped counting. What was the point? The Lewis Wetzel who had terrorized the Ohio frontier began to fade, replaced by a hollow-eyed prisoner who paced his cell like a captured wolf. 11 steps one way, 11 back. The same count as in Harmar's stockade years before. Somewhere in his 2nd year of captivity, a visitor arrived, an American diplomat passing through New Orleans on official business. He'd heard rumors of an American frontiersman being held without trial and had come to investigate. Wetzel? The diplomat peered through the cell bars, clearly shocked at the condition of the prisoner. Lewis Wetzel? Lewis looked up, his once piercing gaze now dull. What's left of him? Good God, man. What have they done to you? Lewis gestured to his surroundings with shackled hands. What does it look like? The diplomat promised action, leveraging newly signed treaties to demand Lewis's release. The United States government doesn't abandon its citizens, he assured Lewis. A bitter laugh escaped the prisoner. The United States government tried to hang me for killing hostiles. Now it wants to save me? Forgive me if I don't hold my breath. But surprisingly, the diplomatic pressure worked. After nearly 2 years in captivity, Lewis Wetzel was released into American custody. The official reason was never made clear. Perhaps the Spanish decided he wasn't worth the diplomatic headache. Or maybe someone in Washington actually had pulled strings on his behalf. Either way, in late 1797, Lewis found himself aboard a ship bound for Philadelphia, a free man once more. The America he returned to barely resembled the one he'd left. The nation had grown, solidified, established itself on the world stage. Philadelphia bustled with commerce and politics, its streets filled with well-dressed citizens who'd never known the terror of a midnight raid or the desperate fight for survival. Lewis walked those streets like a ghost, drawing stares with his frontier clothing and unsettling intensity. The time in prison had changed him, made him leaner, harder, his anger sharpened to a fine edge. The scar on his chest seemed to throb in the eastern cold. "Something wrong with you?" a street vendor asked, noticing Lewis's constant scanning of rooftops and alleyways. "Just old habits," Lewis replied, moving on. He didn't stay in Philadelphia long. As soon as he'd secured supplies and a new rifle, he turned westward, back toward the only home he'd ever known. But even that journey revealed how much had changed. Roads now cut through what had been wilderness. Stagecoach lines connected settlements that had been isolated outposts. The frontier was retreating, civilization advancing. When Lewis finally reached Wheeling Creek in the spring of 1798, he found his childhood home transformed. The isolated cabin of his youth had given way to a proper town. Fort Henry stood neglected, its defensive purpose increasingly obsolete as peace treaties pushed native populations further west. He spent just 2 nights on Wheeling Creek, one with his mother, another at Captain Bonnet's place. The conversations were strained, filled with uncomfortable silences. Lewis spoke little of his imprisonment, and they knew better than to press him. What ate at him most wasn't the physical hardship of captivity. He'd endured worse. It was the humiliation, the helplessness, and most of all, the betrayal. Someone had given him up to Spanish authorities. Someone had traded Deathwind for Spanish silver. "I'll find whoever did it," he told his mother, his voice flat with certainty. "Whoever sold me to the Spanish will answer for it." His mother, older now and worn by frontier hardship, simply nodded. She'd long since stopped trying to gentle her son's nature. Lewis was what the wilderness had made him: implacable, unforgiving. In Wheeling, Lewis stayed with George Cook, a relative. Mrs. Cook, trying to lighten the mood during dinner, teased him about marriage. "A strong man like you needs a good woman," she suggested. "Someone to come home to." Lewis only shook his head. "No woman in this world for me," he said quietly. "Maybe one in heaven." The next morning he was gone without a word. Southward again, back toward the place of his captivity. He had scores to settle, questions to answer, and a traitor to find. No one knows exactly what happened next. Did Lewis find the man who'd betrayed him? Did he settle the score? History doesn't say. What's certain is that Lewis Wetszel remained true to his nature, relentless in pursuit, lethal in execution. Even the most skilled hunters slip occasionally, though. North of the Ohio River, after a long hunt, Lewis let his guard down for just a moment. A flicker of movement caught his eye too late. A native warrior raising a rifle, taking aim. Both men dived behind trees, the shot going wide. Then began one of the most famous standoffs in frontier history. Two master hunters, each waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. An hour passed. Neither moved. Lewis, never known for patience in social settings, had infinite reserves of it when life was on the line. But eventually even he tired of the game. With the crafty resourcefulness that had kept him alive for decades, Lewis fixed his buckskin cap to the end of his ramrod, easing it out just enough to mimic the peak of a human head above his hiding place. The trap was set. A crack split the silence, the bullet tearing through the cap. Before the native warrior could reload, Lewis charged, his own rifle roaring. The man dropped where he stood. Another hunt, another kill. But this time, something was different. As Lewis checked the body, he felt none of the fierce satisfaction that had once driven him. Just a hollow weariness, a sense that he was playing out the final acts of a story that had already reached its climax. The frontier that had shaped Lewis Wetszel was vanishing. The wilderness that had been his home was being parcelled, surveyed, and sold. The enemies that had defined his purpose were either dead or pushed so far west that they no longer threatened his people. What place was there for Deathwind in a land growing ever more peaceful? By 1800, Lewis was spending more time alone, venturing farther from settlements, sometimes disappearing for months at a time. Those who encountered him in the deep woods reported that he seemed more spirit than man, moving like a shadow through territories few whites dared enter. "I saw Wetszel up on Cheat Mountain last fall," a trapper told wide-eyed listeners at a trading post. "He didn't see me, or pretended not to. Had a dozen pelts with him, but that wasn't what he was hunting. You could tell by his eyes, still looking for something, or someone." The legend grew even as the man himself faded from public view. Mothers frightened misbehaving children with his name. Young men tried to emulate his woodcraft, usually with poor results. Natives spoke of him in hushed tones around council fires, some believing he had become an evil spirit that could never truly die. In reality, Louis Wetszel was still very much a man, aging, growing weary, watching the world he'd fought for transform into something he barely recognized. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd helped make the frontier safe enough for the civilization that now had no place for him. One crisp autumn day in 1802, a surveyor working near the headwaters of the Kanawha came across a crude camp deep in the forest. A figure sat beside a small fire, long hair hanging past his shoulders, face weathered by decades in the wilderness. "Wetszel?" the surveyor asked hesitantly. "Louis Wetszel?" The man looked up, dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Depends who's asking." "Nathan Boone," the surveyor replied. "Daniel's son." A flicker of recognition crossed the weathered face. "Your father was a good man, one of the few who understood this land." Nathan settled by the fire, accepting the offered coffee, a luxury deep in the back country. "Father spoke of you, said you were the best scout he ever knew." Louis grunted noncommittally. "Your father was being kind. He was better. He also said you were the deadliest man on the frontier." At this, Louis's expression hardened. That he got right. They talked until dusk, Louis asking about the settlements, the treaties, the changes sweeping across the land. Nathan in turn listened to stories few had ever heard. The true account of Louis's captivity and escape as a boy, the details of hunts too bloody for fireside tales, the private thoughts of a man who had walked the knife edge between savagery and civilization his entire life. As darkness fell, Nathan prepared to leave, having gleaned more frontier wisdom in one afternoon than in years of surveying. "Before you go," Louis said, "a question. Ask it. Was it worth it? All the killing, all the vengeance, did it make a difference?" Nathan considered carefully before answering. "Look east. Families sleep safely in homes that wouldn't exist without men like you. Children grow up without knowing the fear my generation knew." He paused. "So yes, it made a difference. Whether that difference was worth the cost, only you can answer that." Louis nodded slowly, eyes distant. "The cost was high. Will you come back to the settlements?" A humorless smile creased the weathered face. "For what? To be paraded around like some circus curiosity? Come see the famous Indian killer?" He shook his head. "My time has passed, Nathan. Best to let the legend live while the man fades away." They parted at dawn, Nathan returning to his survey crew, Louis disappearing once more into the deepening wilderness. It would be one of the last confirmed sightings of the man behind the myth. As the 19th century dawned, America pushed westward with increasing speed and confidence. The frontier that had defined Louis Wetzel's existence was vanishing, replaced by farms, towns, and eventually states. The old Northwest Territory, once the bleeding edge of settlement, was being transformed into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. And somewhere in that transforming landscape, Deathwind still moved, a remnant of a wilder time, a living ghost haunting the civilized world that no longer needed him, but would never quite forget him. Because some legends don't die, they just fade into the shadows, waiting for the darkness to return. The turn of the century found Louis Wetzel increasingly adrift. The wilderness that had been both his refuge and his battleground was shrinking, carved into farms and townships. The native tribes that had been his lifelong enemies were being pushed ever westward by treaties and force, and the frontier skills that had made him legendary were becoming curiosities rather than necessities. By 1803, at 40 years old, Louis was facing an enemy he couldn't outrun or outfight: time. Decades of hard living had taken their toll. His joints ached from old wounds and countless nights sleeping on frozen ground. His lungs burned from years of powder smoke. The legendary speed that had saved his life so many times was fading, his reactions just a heartbeat slower than they once had been. For a man who'd lived by split-second decisions, that heartbeat could mean the difference between life and death. "Getting old's a bitch," he muttered to himself one morning, massaging feeling back into fingers stiffened by the night's chill. Nobody warns you about that part. Not that anyone would have dared warn Louis Wetszel about anything. Even as his physical prowess diminished, his reputation remained fearsome. People still stepped aside when he entered a room, still lowered their voices when speaking his name. The legend of Deathwind had taken on a life of its own, separate from the aging man who'd created it. That spring brought momentous news. The Louisiana Purchase had more than doubled the size of the young nation. A vast, largely unmapped wilderness now stretched westward, promising new frontiers and new adventures for those bold enough to seize them. Among those preparing to explore this new territory were Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, commissioned by President Jefferson himself to find a route to the Pacific. Their expedition would require men who knew the wilderness intimately, scouts, hunters, interpreters. Rumours spread that they'd approach Louis Wetszel to join them. Can you imagine? A tavern keeper in Wheeling speculated to his customers. Deathwind himself guiding them through Indian country. They'd reach the Pacific in half the time with twice the scalps. The patrons laughed nervously. The idea of Wetszel as official government explorer seemed absurd, like trying to harness a hurricane. Did Lewis and Clark actually invite Wetszel to join their corps of discovery? The historical record is frustratingly vague. Neither man mentions Wetszel in their extensive journals or correspondence, but frontier tales insist the offer was made and declined. "I'm not an explorer," Lewis supposedly told the messenger who brought the invitation. "I'm not looking to find new lands. I'm still figuring out what to do with the old ones." Whether the story is true or merely wishful embellishment, we know Louis Wetszel did not join the expedition. Instead, as Lewis and Clark journeyed up the Missouri in 1804, Wetszel drifted south again, following the Mississippi toward warmer climes and fewer memories. The Lewis that travelled downriver in 1804 was not the same man who'd struck terror into native villages a decade earlier. This Lewis moved more cautiously, spoke more rarely, and preferred solitude to even the rough company of rivermen. The ferocious energy that had driven him since boyhood had burned down to embers, flaring occasionally but mostly just providing enough warmth to keep moving. "You Wetszel?" a young boatman asked him one evening as they shared a campfire on a Mississippi sandbar. "The famous Indian fighter," Lewis gave a non-committal grunt. "My pa told me about you. Said you could reload a rifle while running full tilt. That true?" Lewis stared into the fire. "Used to be." "Could you show me how?" Lewis looked up then, studying the eager young face. He saw himself 30 years earlier, hungry for skills, for respect, for some edge that might keep him alive on the frontier. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "if the weather holds." The next morning Lewis demonstrated the technique he'd perfected, how to hold powder horn and ramrod, how to measure by feel rather than sight, how to spit a ball from your mouth directly into the barrel. The young man watched in awe, then attempted the maneuver himself, spilling powder and dropping his ball in the mud. "Took me years to get it right," Lewis said, more gently than anyone who knew his reputation would have expected. "Practice while running, every day, until your hands bleed and your lungs burn, then practice more." Worth it, though? The young man asked, retrieving his ball. I mean, it kept you alive all those years, right? Lewis was silent for a long moment. Kept me alive, he agreed finally. Not sure it kept me living. By 1805, Lewis had reached the Mississippi Territory, a wild region still largely unsettled by Americans. Here, the rules of civilization felt more distant, the wilderness more familiar. Spanish influence lingered despite official American control, creating a jumbled cultural landscape where a man could disappear if he chose to. Lewis found himself drawn to Natchez, a rough-edged river town with a reputation for vice and violence. It wasn't so different from the New Orleans he'd known a decade earlier, before his imprisonment, a place where fortunes and lives could be won or lost on a single turn of luck. "You've been here before," observed the barkeep at a Natchez tavern, studying Lewis's weathered face. It wasn't a question. Lewis nodded slightly. "Passed through, years back." "Looking for something in particular this time?" A humourless smile crossed Lewis's face. "Peace and quiet, maybe?" The barkeep laughed. "Then you've come to the wrong damned place, friend." But Lewis had. For all its rowdiness, Natchez offered something he'd rarely found elsewhere. Anonymity. Here, he wasn't Deathwind or the famous scout or the notorious killer. He was just another aging frontiersman with too many stories and not enough future. He found lodging with a distant cousin, Philip Sykes, who owned a small farm outside town. The arrangement suited both men. Sykes gained protection and hunting skills, while Lewis secured a quiet place to rest and gather his thoughts. "Stay as long as you like," Sykes offered. "Got plenty of room and not much company." Lewis nodded his thanks, not yet ready to admit that he had nowhere else to go. For almost 3 years, Lewis lived in this strange limbo, not quite settled, not quite wandering. He hunted game for Sykes's table, occasionally guided expeditions into the surrounding wilderness, and spent long hours simply sitting on the porch, watching the world change around him. Occasionally tales from the north reached him, news of treaties being signed, territories becoming states, old enemies laying down their weapons. The frontier he'd known was rapidly disappearing, swallowed by the young nation's voracious appetite for land and order. "Ohio's a state now," Sykes remarked one evening, returning from town with the newspaper. "Has been for a few years, actually." Lewis took the offered paper, studying the unfamiliar boundaries drawn across lands he'd once roamed freely. "Hard to believe," he murmured. "I remember when crossing the Ohio meant taking your life in your hands." "Different world now," Sykes agreed. "Though I hear there's still plenty of trouble out west. This Lewis and Clark expedition stirred up some of the tribes, according to this paper." Lewis folded the newspaper carefully. "There's always trouble where different worlds meet. Just depends on which side you're standing." As 1807 turned to 1808, Lewis's health began to decline more rapidly. A persistent cough rattled his chest, especially in the damp Mississippi mornings. Old wounds ached more fiercely, and fever came and went like an unwelcome guest. "Should see a doctor," Sykes suggested, concerned by his cousin's deterioration. "There's a decent one in Natchez now." Lewis waved away the suggestion. "No doctor can fix what ails me." "And what's that?" Lewis looked out across the fields, toward the distant line of trees that marked the wilderness beyond. "Time," he said simply. "Just time." In the spring of 1808, according to the most widely accepted account, Lewis Wetszel died of what was described as swamp fever, likely malaria or another tropical disease common in the region. He was 45 years old. Sykes buried him on the farm, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. No ceremony, no monument, just a quiet ending for a man whose life had been anything but quiet. And that should have been the end of the story. Louis Wetszel, the terror of the Ohio frontier, laid to rest far from the lands he'd fought to claim. A footnote in the larger narrative of American westward expansion. But legends don't die so easily. Within months of his reported death, stories began circulating. Sightings of a lone hunter moving through the Louisiana Territory, a man with knee-length black hair and eyes that burned like embers. Travellers swore they'd encountered Louis Wetszel alive and well, living among the western tribes or guiding expeditions into unexplored territories. "Saw him with my own eyes," insisted a Missouri fur trapper, "up near the Platte River. Still moves like a ghost, still has that stare that freezes your blood." Others claimed he'd settled in Texas, then still part of Spanish Mexico, with a native wife. Some said he'd joined a band of outlaws preying on Spanish silver shipments. The wildest tales had him living among the very tribes he'd once hunted, adopted into their ranks as a war chief. Author Alan Eckert, who extensively researched Wetzel's life, believed he lived much longer than officially recorded, possibly until 1839, settling along the Brazos River in Texas, far from the Ohio country that had shaped him. The truth, it's lost to history, buried with the man himself. What remains is the legend, growing with each retelling, shifting to suit the needs of those who told it. To settlers pushing into the Northwest Territory, Louis Wetszel was a hero, their protector, their avenger, the man who made the wilderness safe for families and farms. In their telling, he was brave, selfless, and necessary, a brutal answer to brutal times. My grandmother lived near Wheeling during the worst of the raids, an Ohio shopkeeper would later recall. Said they slept soundly knowing Wetszel was out there, watching the trails. Said when word came that he'd killed another warrior, folks would breathe easier for weeks. But to Native Americans, especially the Shawnee and Delaware tribes who bore the brunt of his vengeance, Wetszel was a monster, a killer who made no distinction between warriors and peace advocates, who hunted people for sport and vengeance. The white demon would kill a man bringing peace messages as readily as a raiding warrior, a Delaware elder told a government interpreter in the 1820s. He did not fight for protection, he fought for blood. Both narratives contain truth, and both miss something essential about the man behind the myth. Louis Wetszel was neither simple hero nor simple villain. He was a product of his time and place, shaped by trauma, driven by grief and rage, skilled in the brutal calculus of frontier survival. Had he been born in a different era, or raised in a different environment, perhaps Louis Wetszel would have directed his remarkable abilities toward exploration, or building rather than destruction. Perhaps he might have found peace rather than perpetual war. Perhaps he might have died surrounded by family rather than alone in a distant territory. But the frontier that created Louis Wetszel offered few gentle paths, especially for a boy who'd felt the burn of a bullet and the humiliation of capture before he'd reached manhood. The wilderness wrote its harsh code into his soul, and he followed it to the end. In 1942, more than a century after his purported death, a skeleton was exhumed from what had been the Sykes farm in Mississippi. The bones matched descriptions of Wetszel, tall, powerfully built, with evidence of old injuries consistent with his known wounds. Alongside the remains lay the rusted remnants of a long-barreled rifle and a knife. The skeleton was reinterred with ceremony in McCreary Cemetery in Marshall County, West Virginia, bringing Deathwind home at last to the hills where his legend was born. Or was it him? Some still insist the real Lewis Wetzel died elsewhere, in Texas or Missouri, or some unnamed wilderness where no grave marker records his passing. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting for a man who lived like a shadow and whose true nature remains elusive even centuries later. What's certain is that when Deathwind finally disappeared, whether in Mississippi mud or Texas prairie, the frontier lost one of its deadliest shadows, a man who embodied both its darkest violence and its uncompromising code of survival. But like the frontier itself, Lewis Wetzel didn't simply vanish. He transformed, becoming something more than human, a cautionary tale, a heroic ideal, a complex symbol of America's complicated relationship with its own violent past. As one historian later wrote, "In Lewis Wetzel, America sees what it both fears and secretly admires, the individual unbound by law or social constraint, following a personal code to its ultimate conclusion, regardless of cost. He is the dark reflection of our national mythology, the shadow side of the pioneer spirit." Sleep was coming now for the legend of Lewis Wetzel, just as it had eventually claimed the man. But unlike the restless warrior who had stalked the Ohio wilderness, this sleep would be peaceful, a settling into memory and myth, where the sharp edges of truth slowly smooth under the gentle erosion of time, and as you lie in your own bed, far from the dangers and hardships that shaped men like Lewis Wetzel, perhaps you can appreciate the distance, not just in years but in experience, that separates you from that lawless frontier. The comfort of your pillow, the security of locked doors, the luxury of sleeping without a weapon close at hand, these are gifts purchased in part by the blood and suffering of generations who came before. Whether that price was worth paying, whether men like Lewis Wetzel were heroes or villains or something more complicated than either, those questions will follow you into your dreams, just as they've haunted American consciousness for centuries. But for now, like Deathwind himself, they can wait until morning. As the 19th century marched forward, the America that Lewis Wetzel had fought for transformed beyond recognition. The Ohio River Valley, once the bleeding edge of a young nation, became its heartland. Forests fell to farms, trails widened to roads, and trading posts grew into cities. But even as the physical frontier vanished, the stories remained. Around hearth fires and pot-bellied stoves in taverns and general stores, the legend of Deathwind continued to spread. With each telling, the tales grew taller, the exploits more fantastic, the man more myth than mortal. In 1832, a writer named Joseph Doddridge published a collection of frontier stories titled Notes on the Settlement and Indian Wars of the Western Parts of Virginia and Pennsylvania. Among its pages, Lewis Wetzel featured prominently, portrayed as the archetypal frontier hero, a necessary savage in savage times. Wetzel's strength, courage, and activity were such that no Indian could stand before him, Doddridge wrote. His whole character, in Indian warfare, was that of a master spirit. Doddridge had gathered his tales directly from aging settlers who'd known Wetzel or heard of his exploits firsthand. His account helped transform Lewis from regional legend to national folk hero, cementing his place in the emerging mythology of the American frontier. Did Doddridge get it right? A young historian asked an elderly settler in Wheeling in 1840. Was Wetzel really as deadly as he claims? The old man, who'd been a boy when Lewis still walked the Ohio country, considered the question carefully. Doddridge got the facts mostly straight, he answered slowly. But facts don't tell the whole story, do they? The Lewis I remember wasn't just deadly. He was haunted, like he was fighting something inside himself as much as any enemy outside. This more complex portrait rarely made it into the popular accounts. The Lewis Wetszel of penny dreadfuls and frontier ballads was simpler, more straightforward, the avenging angel, the protector, the living embodiment of frontier justice. By mid-century, Wetszel had taken his place in the pantheon of frontier heroes alongside Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett and Kit Carson. Unlike those men, however, Lewis left no writings, no personal accounts to balance the legends. His story was told entirely by others, shaped to fit their needs and expectations. "There's something uniquely American about Wetszel," observed a Philadelphia magazine editor in 1851. "In Europe, such a man would be considered a murderer, plain and simple. Here, we make him a hero. What does that say about our national character, I wonder?" It was a question few were willing to explore too deeply. Easier to simplify, to justify, to transform the complex reality of frontier violence into cleanly defined battles between good and evil. But some who'd actually walked the bloody ground of the Ohio frontier remembered a messier truth. "You ask about Lewis Wetszel," an aging Virginia militiaman told an interviewer in the 1850s. "I'll tell you what no book will. There was a time we needed men like him, needed that level of willing brutality. That's a hard thing to admit when you're sitting safe in a parlour years later. But out there then, we counted on men who could do what most of us couldn't stomach." He paused, eyes distant with memory. "Doesn't mean we didn't feel sick about it sometimes. Doesn't mean we were right. Just means we survived." This nuance, the moral ambiguity, the uncomfortable necessity of violence, the psychological cost to those who wielded it, largely disappeared from the popular narrative. The Lewis Wetszel who emerged in mid-19th century literature was a simpler creature, the Indian fighter, the avenger, the hero. In 1860, as the nation stood on the brink of civil war, Edward S. Ellis published The Forest Rose, a frontier romance that featured Lewis Wetszel as a central character. Ellis portrayed him as the ultimate woodsman, possessing almost supernatural abilities and unwavering moral certainty. The timing was significant. As America prepared to turn its violence inward, it found comfort in tales of external enemies and uncomplicated heroes. Lewis Wetszel became a convenient symbol, the necessary warrior, the man who did what had to be done to secure civilization's advance. The real Lewis, with his contradictions and complexities, his trauma and rage, disappeared beneath layers of myth-making. The flesh and blood man who had bled and suffered, who had known moments of doubt and darkness, was replaced by a cardboard cutout, the frontier avenger in buckskins. But in quieter corners, among those who studied the frontier with more critical eyes, questions lingered. "We must ask ourselves," wrote a historian in 1870, "whether men like Wetszel were creating security or perpetuating cycles of violence. Did his tactics actually protect settlements, or did they provoke retaliation that claimed more innocent lives?" These questions gained greater urgency as America's frontier experience repeated itself in the West. New generations of settlers pushed into indigenous lands, new cycles of violence erupted, and new Indian fighters emerged to play the role Lewis Wetszel had once filled. Many explicitly modelled themselves on Wetzel's example, adopting not just his tactics, but his implacable hatred of Native Americans. "Learned everything I know from stories of Lewis Wetszel," boasted one notorious scalp hunter, operating in the Southwest during the 1870s. "Man knew how to solve the Indian problem, one shot, one scalp at a time." This grim legacy, the normalization of racial violence as necessary for progress, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of Wetzel's influence. His methods, born of personal trauma and frontier necessity, became justification for systematic brutality divorced from their original context. Yet even as some embraced Wetzel's darkest aspects, others found different lessons in his story. "What strikes me most about Wetzel," wrote a frontier scout in his 1883 memoir, "wasn't his killing prowess but his woodcraft. The man read the wilderness like a book, tracking, hunting, moving silent as smoke. Those skills saved more lives than his rifle ever did." This more balanced view gained traction as the Indian Wars wound down, and America entered a period of reflection about its frontier experience. The bloodier aspects of settlement could now be examined with some historical distance, allowing for more nuanced assessments. By the turn of the 20th century, a new generation of writers began exploring the psychological dimensions of frontier violence. What did it do to a man, they wondered, to live as Louis Wetzel had lived? What inner price did he pay for his outward deadliness? "The true tragedy of Louis Wetzel," wrote an early psychologist in 1905, "may be that he became what he hated most. In fighting savagery, he himself became savage. In protecting civilization, he placed himself beyond its bounds." This interpretation gained further depth as Americans began reckoning with the traumas of the First World War. Suddenly, the experiences of young men forever changed by violence took on new relevance and resonance. Louis Wetzel could be understood not just as hero or villain, but as casualty, a boy whose formative trauma shaped the man he became. "Consider what it meant," urged a 1925 biographical sketch, "for a 14-year-old boy to be shot, captured, to escape, and then dedicate his life to vengeance. Is it any wonder that Louis Wetzel became what he did? The wonder is that he maintained any connection to humanity at all." This more compassionate view didn't excuse Wetzel's brutality, but attempted to understand it, to see the wounded child within the deadly man, to recognize how environment and experience shape even the most extreme human behaviors. By the mid-20th century, as America underwent further social transformations, new questions about Wetzel emerged. Was he a product of his time, or did he represent something timeless about American identity? Was his story a cautionary tale or a celebration of the individualist spirit that defined the frontier? In Wetzel, argued a cultural historian in 1953, we see America's complicated relationship with violence, our official condemnation alongside our private fascination, our public laws and our frontier justice. He embodies contradictions we still haven't resolved. This observation proved prescient. As the civil rights movement forced Americans to confront the legacy of racial violence, figures like Wetzel became increasingly problematic. His casual killing of Native Americans, once celebrated as heroism, now appeared as something darker, an early chapter in a long national story of racial elimination. Yet even as this critical reassessment gained momentum, Wetzel retained defenders who insisted on viewing him within the context of his time and circumstances. "Before we judge Wetzel too harshly," cautioned a West Virginia historian in 1961, "we should remember that he lived in a world where mercy was often fatal. The moral luxury of condemning his actions is available to us precisely because men like him secured the peace we now enjoy." This tension between understanding historical context and applying more universal moral standards continues to shape discussions of Wetzel today. Was he hero, villain, victim, or some complex combination of all three? Perhaps the most honest answer comes from a Shawnee elder who in 1989 offered this assessment. "Your Louis Wetzel and our warriors were mirror images, men shaped by the same cycle of violence, each believing absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. The tragedy wasn't that they fought, it was that they couldn't imagine any other way to live. This wisdom, recognizing the shared humanity on both sides of the frontier's bloody divide, offers a perspective that transcends simpler narratives of heroes and villains. It allows us to see Louis Wetszel not as icon but as human being, caught in historical currents larger than himself, making choices from a limited set of terrible options. It also reminds us that the frontier experience wasn't simply white settlers versus Native Americans, but a complex web of individuals, communities and nations, each with their own motivations, fears and hopes. Louis Wetzel's brothers, for instance, followed similar paths as Indian fighters, creating a family legacy of frontier violence. Martin Wetszel, Louis's older brother, fought alongside Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton, wielding a tomahawk as his favoured weapon. Jacob, the younger brother who had shared Louis's captivity, carried his own scars from that formative trauma. The Wetzels weren't just individuals, noted a genealogist who traced the family history. They were a phenomenon, an entire clan shaped by frontier violence and dedicated to a particular vision of settlement and security. This familial dimension adds another layer to Louis's story, suggesting that his choices were influenced not just by personal trauma, but by family identity and expectation. He wasn't a lone wolf, but part of a pack, bound by blood and shared experience to a particular path. Yet Louis stood apart even from his brothers in the intensity of his dedication to violence. Where they fought when necessary, he made fighting his purpose. Where they eventually settled into more conventional lives, he remained the perpetual warrior, unable or unwilling to adapt to peacetime. There's something almost Greek about Wetzel's tragedy, observed a literature professor in '95. He's like Achilles, defined so completely by war that peace renders him obsolete. His greatest strength becomes his fatal weakness once the context changes. This literary perspective offers yet another lens through which to view Louis Wetzel, not just as historical figure but as archetypal character, embodying timeless themes of vengeance, identity, and the cost of violence to those who wield it. In recent decades, as Americans have become more willing to confront the darker aspects of frontier history, Wetzel's story has been increasingly approached through multiple perspectives, including those of the native peoples who were his primary targets. When settlers tell Wetzel's story, noted a Delaware tribal historian in 2001, they focus on his skill, his courage, his necessity. When we tell it, we remember the peaceful leaders he killed alongside warriors, the cycles of vengeance he perpetuated, the families he destroyed who had nothing to do with his personal vendetta. This more complete picture, seeing the ripple effects of violence from all sides, helps us understand not just Louis Wetzel the man, but the broader patterns of frontier conflict that shaped American development. It also raises uncomfortable questions about how we choose our heroes and what values we celebrate in retelling their stories. Every nation needs its myths, wrote a cultural anthropologist in 2010. The question is whether we can mature enough as a society to embrace more honest myths, stories that acknowledge complexity, that don't require simplistic heroes and villains, that allow us to see our history in all its messy, contradictory fullness. For Louis Wetzel, this more honest myth-making might mean acknowledging both his remarkable skills and his moral failures, both the trauma that shaped him and the suffering he inflicted, both his historical necessity and his personal excesses. It might mean seeing him not as hero or monster, but as human being, extraordinary in some ways, deeply flawed in others, forever marked by the wilderness that claimed him as both home and battleground. In the end, perhaps that's the most valuable perspective we can gain from Deathwind's story. Not simple judgment, but deeper understanding of how environment shapes character, how trauma creates legacy, and how the past continues to haunt our present. Because while Louis Wetszel himself has been dust for centuries, the questions his life raises remain vitally alive. How do we balance security and humanity in dangerous times? What price are we willing to pay for safety? What happens to those who stand at the bleeding edge of conflict? And how do we remember them once the danger has passed? These aren't just historical curiosities, but urgent modern concerns. In a world still marked by violence and vengeance, still struggling to find alternatives to cycles of retaliation, Louis Wetzel's shadow remains longer than we might wish to admit. Perhaps the best epitaph for this complex American figure comes not from historical records or frontier ballads, but from a simple observation made by a park ranger at Fort Henry in 2015. When visitors ask about Louis Wetzel, she noted, I tell them he was exactly what his time and place demanded. The real question isn't whether we should judge him, but whether we've truly moved beyond the conditions that created him. As you drift towards sleep, comfortable in a world far removed from the dangers Louis Wetzel faced, that question might be worth considering. Have we truly created a world where such men are no longer necessary? Or do we still, in crisis, call upon those willing to cross moral boundaries in the name of protection? The answer may not come before sleep claims you, but like Louis Wetzel himself, it will be waiting when you awaken, challenging you to look more deeply at the stories we tell about our past and the realities we create in our present. The wind whispers through trees outside your window, gentler than the winds that once carried Deathwind through the Ohio wilderness, but perhaps carrying echoes of those distant storms. Listen closely, and you might hear what Louis heard in those dark forests long ago. Not just danger, but possibility. Not just death, but life in its most elemental form. That's the final gift of frontier stories like Wetzel's, reminding us of our capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable resilience, for both moral failure and extraordinary courage. In that complexity lies our full humanity, as messy and contradictory as the frontier itself. The sun sets on the Ohio River Valley much as it did in Louis Wetzel's time, painting the hills in gold and shadow, setting the water aflame with reflected light. But the world those rays illuminate bears little resemblance to the wilderness Deathwind once haunted. Where dense forests once stood, fields stretched toward the horizon. Where native war parties and settler militias once clashed, highways carry travellers safely across once contested ground. Where Louis Wetzel once moved like a deadly shadow, tourists now visit historic sites, trying to imagine a world so different from their own. In Marshall County, West Virginia, not far from where the Wetzel family homestead once stood, a small cemetery holds what are believed to be Louis Wetzel's remains, transferred there in 1942 from their original resting place in Mississippi. The modest gravestone bears no elaborate inscription, no grand epitaph, just a name, 2 dates, and the quiet acknowledgement of a life that bridged 2 centuries and 2 worlds. Yet this simple marker represents just one physical manifestation of a legacy that extends far beyond stone and soil. Louis Wetzel's influence, both celebrated and criticized, ripples through American culture in ways both obvious and subtle, acknowledged and unconscious. Most directly, his name marks the landscape he once defended. Wetzel County, West Virginia, established in 1846, commemorates not just Lewis but the entire Wetszel family. The Lewis Wetszel Wildlife Management Area offers 13,590 acres of protected forest and wildlife habitat, ironically preserving the same wilderness Lewis spent his life taming. "Kind of strange, isn't it?" observed a park ranger there in 2018. "We're protecting and preserving the very wilderness that men like Wetszel fought to transform. History has a sense of humour sometimes." But Wetzel's most enduring legacy exists not in place names or monuments, but in literature and popular culture, where his exploits, both real and embellished, help shape America's understanding of its own frontier past. The great Western novelist Zane Grey, himself born in Ohio, immortalized Lewis Wetzel in a trilogy of frontier novels, Betty Zane, The Spirit of the Border, and The Last Trail. Gray's Wetzel is a romanticized figure, dark, dangerous, but ultimately noble, a necessary force in a violent world. "He's like the shadow of the frontier," says one character in The Spirit of the Border, "wild, free, deadly to his red foes, yet gentle to his friends." Gray's novels, published in the early 20th century, reached millions of readers, cementing Wetzel's place in the national mythology of frontier heroes. Through these widely read works, Deathwind's influence extended far beyond the Ohio Valley, becoming part of America's collective imagination of its own past. "I first encountered Lewis Wetzel in a dusty copy of Spirit of the Border when I was 12, recalled Western historian Dale Walker. Gray's version was heavily romanticized, of course, but it captured something essential about frontier life: the constant tension, the brutal choices, the grey areas between survival and savagery. This literary Wetzel, part historical figure, part frontier archetype, influenced generations of American storytelling, from dime novels to Hollywood westerns. The lone avenger, the skilled woodsman, the man apart from civilization yet fighting for its future. These character types owe much to the real and imagined Lewis Wetzel. You can trace a direct line from Wetzel to characters like Hawkeye in Last of the Mohicans, to countless Western heroes, noted a film historian in 2005. That complicated figure, the white man who adopts Indian ways to fight Indians, who's more at home in the wilderness than in civilization, that's Wetzel's literary descendant. But as cultural attitudes shifted throughout the 20th century, so too did interpretations of Wetzel's life and actions. The unquestioned heroism of earlier accounts gave way to more critical assessments, reflecting changing views on frontier violence and American expansion. Wait, hang on, you might be thinking. Are we really supposed to admire someone who killed people for their race? And that's exactly the question that makes Wetzel's legacy so complex. By modern moral standards, many of his actions are indefensible. Yet judging historical figures solely by contemporary values risks missing the context that shaped them, the daily threats, the limited options, the grief and trauma that defined frontier experience. "I'm not saying what Wetzel did was right," explained a descendant of Ohio Valley settlers in a 2012 interview. "I'm saying I understand why he did it. There's difference between explanation and justification. This nuanced view, understanding without necessarily approving, perhaps offers the most honest approach to figures like Lewis Wetzel. It allows us to acknowledge the real dangers frontier families faced, while also recognizing the humanity of those on all sides of the conflict. Because the frontier wasn't simply a place, but a process. A violent, messy transformation that left scars on every community it touched. Native peoples lost lands and lives. Settlers lived in constant fear. Men like Lewis Wetzel became weapons forged in trauma and necessity. their humanity sometimes casualty to the roles they played. The real tragedy of the frontier, observed Pulitzer-winning historian Patricia Limerick, was that it created impossible situations for everyone involved. Native peoples fighting for survival, settlers seeking security, soldiers following orders, all trapped in cycles of violence with no clear path to peace. Wetszel embodied this tragedy more completely than most. Shot and captured at 14, he emerged from that crucible permanently changed, dedicated to a path of vengeance that would define his life and echo through American history long after his death. Imagine carrying that kind of trauma, suggested a psychologist specializing in historical trauma in 2019. No counseling, no processing, just the immediate need to survive. Of course, it shaped everything that followed. How could it not? This psychological perspective offers another layer for understanding Wetszel, not excusing his brutality but contextualizing it within patterns of trauma response that transcend time and culture. The boy who watched his younger brother dragged away, who felt a bullet tear through his own chest, who escaped against impossible odds, that boy never really disappeared, even as the man became legend. I always come back to that moment, reflected author Alan W. Eckert, whose Frontier histories include detailed accounts of Wetszel. That 14-year-old bleeding, terrified, facing death or worse, everything that followed, every kill, every scalp, every act of vengeance begins there. Yet Wetzel's story isn't solely defined by trauma and violence. His extraordinary woodcraft, his deep knowledge of the wilderness, his independence of spirit, these too are part of his legacy, qualities that connected him to the land in ways few could match. He could read the forest like we read books, a frontier descendant told an oral historian in the 1930s, recounting family stories of Wetszel. Knew which way the wind would shift by watching cloud patterns, could find water in places that looked bone dry to everyone else, wasn't just good at killing, was good at living out there. This intimate connection with the natural world represents another facet of frontier experience that shaped American identity. The belief that wilderness, while dangerous, also offered a kind of freedom and self-reliance unavailable in more settled regions. The frontier created Americans, wrote historian Frederick Jackson Turner in his famous thesis. Out there, European ways fell away, and something new emerged, more independent, more adaptable, more distinctly American. While modern historians have extensively critiqued Turner's thesis, it captures something true about how Americans have understood their relationship to wilderness. The frontier experience, including its violence and hardship, became central to national mythology, with figures like Lewis Wetszel embodying its most extreme expressions. We want to believe we're civilized, observed a cultural anthropologist studying American frontier myths, but we also glorify the outlaws, the rebels, the men who take justice into their own hands. That contradiction runs deep in American culture, and Wetszel sits right at its heart. Perhaps this explains why Wetszel remained such a complicated figure in American memory, both celebrated and condemned, hero and anti-hero, necessary evil and cautionary tale. He represents aspects of national experience that resist simple categorization or comfortable moral judgment. The thing about Wetszel, said a historian at a 2020 symposium on frontier violence, is that he forces us to confront the messier parts of our past. We can't put him in a neat box labelled hero or villain. He's both and neither, which makes him a much more honest window into frontier reality than more sanitized figures. This honesty, acknowledging the full complexity of frontier experience rather than settling for comfortable myths, may be Wetzel's most valuable legacy. His story reminds us that history isn't a simple morality tale, but a human drama played out in specific times and places, shaped by forces both personal and historical. My great-grandfather knew Wetzel, an elderly West Virginia resident claimed in a 1970s oral history project. Said he was the most fearsome man he ever met, but also the saddest. Said his eyes had seen too much, like he was already halfway in the next world. That haunted quality, the psychological cost of violence to those who wield it, is often missing from romanticized accounts of frontier heroes. Yet it's perhaps the most relevant aspect of Wetzel's story for modern audiences, offering insights into the trauma of combat that transcend historical specifics. When veterans return from war zones today, noted a therapist working with combat trauma, they face many of the same challenges as frontier fighters like Wetzel. How do you rejoin a peaceful society when violence has become your primary language? How do you process experiences that others can't possibly understand? These questions haunted Lewis Wetzel throughout his life. Unable to adapt to changing times, increasingly isolated as the frontier receded, he embodied the paradox of the successful warrior. Having helped secure the peace, he found himself obsolete within it. That's the thing about men like Wetzel, observed a frontier reenactor who portrays him at historical events. Society needs them in crisis, but doesn't quite know what to do with them afterward. We ask them to become something inhuman, then expect them to switch back when the danger's past. This perspective offers a more compassionate view of Wetzel, not as monster or hero, but as someone shaped by circumstances few can imagine, carrying burdens few would choose to bear. It allows us to acknowledge the horror of his actions while recognizing the humanity behind them. I don't think Wetzel was born to violence, suggested a biographer who spent years researching his life. I think violence was born into him, through that first traumatic encounter, and he never found a way out of its grip. As the Ohio frontier faded into history, as forests became farms and trails became roads, the need for men like Lewis Wetzel diminished. Yet the questions his life raises remain relevant, about justice and vengeance, about trauma and healing, about the line between necessary violence and excessive brutality. We still face these questions today, remarked a military ethicist in a 2021 interview. When is force justified? How much is too much? What happens to those we ask to use it on our behalf? Wetzel's story isn't just frontier history, it's a case study in the moral complexity of violence in human affairs. This ongoing relevance may explain why Lewis Wetzel continues to fascinate us more than 2 centuries after his death. His story touches on timeless human concerns, while also illuminating specific American experiences, the collision of cultures on the frontier, the psychological cost of constant danger, the moral compromises born of survival. In the end, wrote a contemporary historian, Wetzel matters not because he was admirable, often he wasn't, but because he was real. His life, with all its contradictions and complexities, offers a window into a formative period of American experience that sanitized accounts can't provide. As night falls across the Ohio Valley, as the river flows past lands once contested in blood, Lewis Wetzel's spirit seems to linger, not as the romanticized hero of frontier ballads or the simple villain of revisionist histories, but as something more human and therefore more valuable, a man shaped by his time and place, making choices from limited, often terrible options. The wilderness that formed him is largely gone now. The The conflicts that defined him have been settled for generations. Yet something of Deathwind remains in the American character, in our celebration of self-reliance, our suspicion of authority, our capacity for both extraordinary violence and remarkable compassion. We are all, in some sense, Wetzel's children, suggested a cultural historian, shaped by the frontier experience even if we've never set foot in a wilderness. His story is part of our cultural DNA, whether we recognize it or not. As you drift towards sleep, warm and secure in a world Louis Wetzel helped create but never lived to see, perhaps you can feel some connection to that distant figure, not endorsing his methods but acknowledging the shared humanity that bridges centuries and circumstances. The darkness outside your window isn't the same darkness that hid Wetzel as he stalked the Ohio wilderness. The silence isn't the watchful silence of a frontier night. The comfort of your bed bears no resemblance to the forest floor or crude cabin platforms where he snatched moments of restless sleep. Yet something connects you to that time and place, some thread of continuity that runs through American experience, linking your world to his despite the vast differences between them. Perhaps, as consciousness fades and dreams begin to form, you might glimpse something of what Louis Wetzel saw in those ancient forests, the beauty alongside the danger, the freedom alongside the hardship, the possibility alongside the peril. And perhaps you might find, in that momentary connection across time, a deeper appreciation for both the distance travelled and the journey still ahead, as individuals, as communities, as a nation still wrestling with the complex legacy of its frontier past. Sleep well, knowing that the wilderness that once claimed Louis Wetzel has been tamed, but never quite forgotten. Its echoes remain, softened by time but still audible to those who listen closely enough. And in those echoes, if you're very still, you might just catch the whisper of Deathwind, moving once more through the trees of memory.